My guest here is Professor Donna Ginther, who's Professor of Economics and the Director of the Institute for Policy and Social Research at the University of Kansas. Her research interests include scientific labor markets, gender differences in employment outcomes, wage inequality, scientific entrepreneurship, and children's education attainments. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you.
So to start with one of your working papers, Women and STEM, that it sort of set the context for many of the other papers we want to talk about. So in this one, you say researchers from economics, sociology, and psychology and other disciplines have studied the persistent underrepresentation of women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. We argue that women's underrepresentation is concentrated in the math-intensive science fields of geosciences, engineering, economics, math, computer science, and physical science. Our analysis concentrates on the environmental factors that influence ability, preferences, and rewards for those choices. Yeah, so I can relate to this, Donna. I went to engineering school in India when there were only 1% women in the entire university, and that was in the mid to late 80s. Things have improved quite a bit since then, but it is sort of persistent, isn't it? So what are you finding here in terms of the reasons for this persistent underrepresentation, I should say?
Well, it happens early in childhood. It happens in home, in the home. It happens in schools. So what we find is that there's a belief that girls aren't good at math, either by parents or by teachers, and that this can set the stage for very different career outcomes. Victor Levy did a very interesting study in Israel where he was looking at math tests graded by the teacher who knows the students and a national math test that was randomly graded. And the tests graded by the teacher always graded the girls lower in math relative to the national anonymous test, right? So, and you could measure the degree of bias of a teacher against girls, and they found that girls that encountered biased teachers were less likely to go on and take advanced math courses, major in math-intensive STEM-related fields, and work in those occupations. So that's one example. There's another example from the psychology literature that shows that if you have a math-anxious parent, and that parent helps with math, then the kid picks up that anxiety and brings it forward. I mean, there are myriad examples in the literature about how, either within the family or in the schools, girls get treated differently when it comes to mathematics.
So sort of the initial conditions, whether at home or teachers in schools and so on, if they treat you differently early on, then that sort of sets the path, right? And those deviations, albeit could be quite small initially, ultimately end up with a huge departure between these two cohorts, and boys and girls.
Right. And I mean, and that can have long-lasting career outcomes, right?
Long-lasting outcomes. So that's pretty clear. So the initial conditions, I think from a sociology perspective, it's nearly impossible to correct that. I think the bias appears to be endemic in society. And I don't know if there is anything from a policy perspective one could do about it.
Policy-wise, I think that it's important to, talk to teachers. I mean, you can't really necessarily unpack what's going on in the household, but I do think it's important to talk to teachers and let them know what the research shows and say, hey, think about how you're treating your girls relative to your boys. I actually encountered a colleague. I had mentioned this to him, and he said, that had we used to be colleagues. He's at a different university. And I saw him recently. He's like, your research on girls in math had a huge impact on my kids. And he had boy-girl twins, and the daughter was encountering challenges in her math classes. And so they put her into the kids into a school where they had single-sex instruction on math and science. And once they did that, his daughter blossomed. Had no problems with her math tests or her math scores, and I believe is going to be pursuing a math-intensive degree in college, right? So, I mean, that's an anecdote, but I mean, it can show how that having that information can inform both parents and teachers to address these issues. There's also a body of research that we cite in that paper that shows that norms within a region of the country, right, also affect math performance. So the math gap is much lower in the Northeast than it is in the Southeast. In the Southeast, you have more traditional gender norms, and in the Northeast, you have more egalitarian norms. So it's a very complex relationship.
Yeah, so how does it internationally? So I would imagine if egalitarian views are positively correlated with lower bias between genders, I would imagine Scandinavian countries might show much less. Is that what you're finding in the data?
Well, it's interesting. I encountered a paper in PNAS about this. So in these very egalitarian countries, there's even less majoring in math-intensive STEM fields. And so trying to understand what's driving that, maybe preferences. But it's, even if there are egalitarian values, girls may be less likely. In some countries, Islamic countries where Islam dominates, there's single-sex education, and you see that girls outperform boys in tests of math. So, I mean, it's a very rich and interesting and complex relationship.
Yeah, I was also thinking, Asian countries like Korea, Japan, and India to some extent, where, at least where the place that I grew up in India, there's a lot of focus on education. And so at least primary to high school education. So everybody went to school, that was expected. And everybody took everything, that was also expected. So in some sense, this prescriptive, systematic focus on education might reduce the bias, but then is that a good thing? I'm specifically thinking about Japan, some country like that, especially because you're finding a difference between, let's say, Scandinavia and the Muslim countries. That seems quite an interesting concept.
Right. Japan is very different with respect to women. Japan is a country that the birth rate is below replacement. Populations are declining. They need more women in the labor force, but they don't have the cultural norms and the institutions that facilitate that, right? So, if you're a young woman going to college in Japan, and you look at the future and you want to have a family, you're probably not going to want to invest in a STEM intensive degree, right, where your skills depreciate. So, I mean, each country, I mean, even in the United States, each region has differential impacts. So it's a very localized phenomenon.
And I think you talk about this or other papers that women ultimately have kids, maybe increasingly less in the modern world, but generally speaking. And that is a huge discontinuity. And so any investment that you make into education have overall lower returns in a horizon between men and women. So the investment returns that you expect from education for a woman, because of this discontinuity, is lower, right?
Well, it depends, right? If you're in a society that has, affordable childcare and paid family leave, then you can stay attached to the labor force and continue to earn that return. But if all of the caregiving responsibilities fall on the woman, then, most of them will have to leave the labor force at some point to take care of their kids. And that's going to affect their investment decisions in human capital.
So that has some policy implications. So maybe even tax policy, in the sense that if a country wants to sort of maximize productivity, they have to take this discontinuity into account till we figure out how men can get pregnant, which could be a long time.
Right.
We have this differential aspect, right? So it could be an overall policy question for a country.
Well, I think it's a policy question we're dealing with in the United States right now. I was just looking before we got on, I was looking at a New York Times article about working mothers. And they were quoting some economists that I know. Shout out to Misty Hagenes, whose work, she's a co-author of mine, and she was featured in today's New York Times talking about mothers having to work during the pandemic. And, our childcare is not publicly subsidized widely in the United States. And it's, we did a study in Kansas that showed that it costs more to put your infant in daycare than it does to send your 18-year-old to college at the University of Kansas, right? So that gives you an idea of the financial burden of childcare. And, if you do not have adequate childcare, you're not going to have full labor force participation of your women. And that's going to create a drag on your economy. And part of the labor shortage I think we're facing right now, part but not all, can be traced back to, the childcare crisis, because a lot of childcare providers closed during the pandemic and haven't reopened. Those that have remained open are having trouble finding workers and passing higher costs on to families who, in some cases, just simply can't afford it.
What we need is a university for infants, Donna. That might make it easier. So in this paper, you also talk about, this is sort of a little bit of a different view. You say here our results are consistent with preferences and psychological explanations for the underrepresentation. What do you mean by that? Preferences and psychological explanations?
Well, so preferences meaning there's a body of research, sort of like people versus things, and women gravitate towards people-focused activities where men are more thing-oriented. And so if you're interested in people, you might major in psychology more than in economics, where you would be interested in abstract models. So that would be how I would, show the difference between in how preferences may play a role in what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of an evolutionary basis to it, right? So in one of my books called Flexibility, I argued that right from the beginning, 200,000 years ago, women managed very complex human organizations. They were the center of that management process, whereas men tend to have more of a process view. They go out and hunt and, those types of things. And that is not really amenable to management of very complex societies, a lot of non-linearities, a lot of uncertainties. So I am sort of overgeneralizing this, but in general, men appear to be very process-oriented, in my view.
I mean, I think that's borne out by the choices they make with respect to what they study and the occupations that they gravitate towards, right?
Yeah, so you are looking at sort of a cross-sectional data here, and you're saying women have a preference for human-related activities, societal activities, whereas men, I think about engineering, economics, two of my fields, and I love models. Building models have a lot more utility than interacting with humans, in which case, at the end of the day, they will gravitate toward in that direction, right? That's what we are finding in the data.
Right, right.
And so that's problematic in some ways.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, I agree, but I think that there are women who are analytical and like these conceptual worlds like economics, and there are men who specialize in psychology and sociology. So I mean, yeah, a world in which people can enter these fields and we can have this diversity of thought, I think, leads to greater research understanding. So,
would you say the entry costs or the entry barriers to a profession like economics and engineering are lower for men compared to women, and so you have to put in a lot more investment to go into those fields? Is that what we're seeing in the data?
well, I mean, I don't know that the entry costs are lower. I mean, you have to take the GRE, you have to have, the same math curriculum in order to get in, right? But the number of women at risk of being, who have taken that mathematical curriculum that would allow them to get a PhD in economics is much lower than the number of men. And so trying to explain what's driving that investment decision prior to trying to get a PhD is really important, right? And that's part of what we were trying to do in those series of papers, is to say, hey, a lot of people look at majors, PhD, matriculation, graduation, showing up in academia, and a lot of that, getting to that college major, a lot of that happens way earlier, and we bring that research to bear.
So going back to this preferences idea and going back to what we are talking about in terms of initial conditions, do we find a high correlation between parents who are technical to their daughters going into STEM fields?
There is some relationship. If you have a parent in STEM, you're more likely to major in STEM.
You're more likely to go into STEM. So that also reinforces. So this almost seems orthogonal to me, Donna. I don't know if I'm thinking about this correctly. So the preference axis is basically saying women prefer human-oriented activities,
right?
And men prefer more things, as you say, oriented activities. That is sort of orthogonal to this initial condition idea, where if the parents are in STEM, then the daughters get into STEM. So how do you sort of compare between those two effects in what we're seeing in the data?
Well, I think it's really complicated, right? I mean, part of this is taking, this paper is looking at the literature and kind of trying to make sense of the literature and organize the literature and the findings in a consistent way, right? So, in order to to do the research on this topic, you really need to divide and conquer and look at different parts of the life course and figure out what's going on. And so I guess I wouldn't say that we explain everything, right? You can't. But we do have, what this paper has identified is a set of consensus arguments coming out of the economics literature mostly about why women are underrepresented. So I think, the preferences, the results are consistent with preferences, but there may be things that happened early on that that shaped those preferences, right? Right. And so teasing that apart is really hard. And, it's even harder to do in economics these days with the emphasis on causal analysis, because there's not some policy shift that you can identify the causal effect of how that shapes your preferences. We don't really have a good model in my mind, of how preferences are formed. And, when I was in graduate school, if you think about preferences, they were supposed to be immutable, right? Preferences don't change.
Right.
That makes our models tractable. But I know that over time, my preferences have changed. So, that sort of introduces a different type of social science when you think about, how preferences might evolve over time, how experiences shape preferences and things of that nature.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, if you look at the last 25 years, technology has advanced so much. So if you're reading anything related to technology today, there's a lot more data than, let's say, 25 years ago, 30 years ago. Your preferences might have been more fashioned by people close to you, like your parents or your teachers. But now Google can possibly
Right.
give you a preference. Yeah.
Right.
And that's quite different. And so do we have any data on sort of dropout rates? So I'm thinking, kids going into undergraduate school in STEM related fields, boys and girls. Is there a differential between dropout rates between the two?
I think that young women are more likely to leave a STEM degree. But, I'm not as familiar with that literature. It's not coming to mind right now.
Do you have a speculation why that's the case?
Again, it's very complicated, right? So, it may be that the coursework isn't, something that they thought it would be. It could be, they're not taking classes with their friends, or look around and they're the only young woman in the classroom, right? It could be we do know that there are role model effects, that if a young woman in college is assigned to a female instructor in a male-dominated profession, that nudges them in the direction of pursuing that major. So if it doesn't affect men, by the way. If a young man is taught by a woman, it doesn't affect his propensity to major one way or the other. But if a woman can see herself in an instructor, she may be more likely to pursue that major. So that, gives you a policy sense for why you should have a diverse faculty, right?
Yeah, nobody wants to go to school with a bunch of nerds. That's very clear.
Right.
And so this idea that if you have your own gender in the faculty, your preferences get reinforced and your chance of dropout is lower, is actually quite interesting. So it means that there's some sort of a stress in the academic environment when you're swimming, let's say, up the up the river, or whatever the right term would be. You decide to go into STEM, but then you find that it is very, very male dominated, both in the classroom and in the academic faculty. Then all fun goes from it. Even if it's not just
yes, yeah. It just, you may not see yourself in the environment. Right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I want to go into a couple of your other papers. You had a reasonably old one, Race, Ethnicity, and NIH Research Awards. You say in this paper from 2011, we investigated the association between the U.S. National Institutes of Health, NIH, R01 applicants' self-identified race or ethnicity, and the probability of receiving an award by using data from NIH Impact 2 grant database, the Thomson Reuters, Web of Sciences, and other sources. While the proposals with strong priority scores were equally likely to be funded regardless of race, we find that Asians are 4 percentage points and Black or African American applicants are 13 percentage points less likely to receive NIH investigative initiative research funding compared to whites. That's really interesting. And so there are two things here. You say here, proposal with strong priority scores were equally likely to be awarded. to be funded.
Mhm.
The next step down from that, there's a lot more noise in it, sounds to me, right? There's a lot more uncertainty.
So I mean, the NIH has a very standardized review process. So your proposal comes in, and it's initially reviewed by the study section. And some proposals aren't competitive, and those don't really receive a score. And that's about half. So they're not scored. And of those scored, then they're reviewed and discussed and given an overall priority score. And so what we found in that study and a follow-up study in 2018 is that the score determines whether or not you get money. Proposals by Black or African American investigators were less likely to receive a score and received lower scores. Our 2018 paper, which redid the analysis with better measures of publications, found that the number of publications and the quality of the publications were lower among Black or African American applicants, and this explained about half of the funding gap.
So the quality of application. So I don't know anything about this, Don. I'm just wondering. So there's a technical quality question, and then there is sort of a cosmetic quality question. So if the proposal is coming out of some top 5 university, there is some cosmetic expectation of that proposal.
Right.
So if you control for that, did you find any difference?
They'll find the gap. Yeah, I mean, we controlled for everything we could think of. And so, 2011, we could explain a third of the gap. Not a third, a small, so 3 percentage points of the 13 percentage point gap we could explain. We explained half of it with better measures of prior scientific productivity. So number of publications, the journals that they were published in, the strength of your co-authorship networks and things of that nature. Interestingly, it didn't end up in being published, but we found the gap was for Black scientists was being driven for the basic science, the bench science fields. If you look at psychology, which is also funded by the NIH, Black investigators had a slight advantage or no disadvantage. So it was really within the narrow fields of the bench science that where you saw the gap the most.
I mean, it's really puzzling. I mean, I would imagine when the NIH evaluators sit down and look at proposals, they're not thinking about race, I would imagine.
Race. So, there was a study that came out last year by NIH people at the Center for Science Review. And what they did was they took proposals that had been reviewed, then they anonymized them and had them re-reviewed. And they found that the Black investigator scores didn't change. But the anonymous reviewed white proposals fell. Their scores got worse. So there might be some sort of like math, some advantage to being well known or seeing those names associated with the research that, they get the benefit of the doubt or they get higher scores if you know that person, right? Or if you're familiar with their work. And once you anonymize it, then the actual impact is lower. So and then I saw another paper at the American Economic Association this past winter, which found a similar effect with respect to publication review. And this was looking at men and women, that when it was anonymized, men scored lower than when it was non-anonymized. So it may be that instead of bias against a particular group, it could be bias in favor of the majority group. which I mean, that's really an interesting perspective on it. I mean, there's just 2 studies that have found that, but it's got me thinking, where else is that showing up, right?
Yes, really interesting. So I'm thinking, Donna, here, the language that you use in your proposals, maybe there's some sort of secret handshake process going on here.
There's another paper about that. Kolev and co-authors have a working paper where they were looking at the Gates Foundation review process. And those were all anonymous, but proposals by females scored worse. And I thought that was odd, given that you don't see a gender gap in biomedical research funding at the NIH, right? So there's, men and women are equally likely to get funded in NIH these days. That wasn't true in the past, but it is true now. Right, so why is it at the Gates Foundation? And if you dig into how the Gates Foundation does its review, they send 50 to 100 proposals to a reviewer. These are 3 to 5 pages long. And I imagine that after you've read about 10 of those, when somebody says, this is groundbreaking, revolutionary, saying all of these super words, kind of overselling the results, which is also seemed to be correlated with being a male investigator, that rational inattention of going over 100 proposals may have disadvantaged women's proposals, which were more precise.
Yeah, men are always very confident in their capabilities. I have noticed that in presentations in literature. So there might be, I'm thinking, Donna, here, if I deploy an AI agent on these proposals and train it using historical data, that AI agent will be very efficient in picking up white men proposals, because historically that is what dominated the data set. I mean, we have similar things going on in healthcare. There was an insurance company in New York had an AI program that showed that African Americans required less healthcare, less care in general, because in the past they got less care. And so, so those types of things. I mean, human brain is not substantially different from a computer. It is an accumulation of biases, I would argue. And so that is really what we're finding, right? I mean, so even if the proposals are anonymized, what you're saying is that there are things in the proposals that sort of tells you, what your bias should confirm. And so anonymization is not going to work, because you already have.
I mean, to be clear, the anonymization didn't find huge discrepancies, right? It didn't find evidence of bias per se. It found movements in scores, but the problem with anonymizing science is that science is small, right? And especially different areas of science, you tend to know everybody who works in your area, right? And so, especially if you're an established investigator, people can tell it's your science, even if they go through and mark out all your self-citations or whatever, right? So it's really hard to anonymize science in the first place. But I have a paper that shows the peer review process does a pretty good job at NIH, does a good job of identifying good science and future scientists.
Yeah, I'm a proponent of, I want to get your perspective on this, Donna. This is not in your research, but I'm a proponent of using artificial intelligence in making these decisions, because I argue that AI will be a lot less biased than a typical human. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, that would be a hard problem, right? So how can you, I mean, I give in a NIH proposal, I give a data preliminary results, right? I think it would be really hard for an AI system at this time to read a data table and all the nuances in the footnotes and in the text about what that data actually shows. And because that pilot study is going to be the difference between funding and not funding, right? So, I mean, I think that an AI system can identify fields of science, can identify, sort of like what the outcomes of the proposed outcomes are. I guess I'm not sufficiently familiar with an AI approach to be able to say, well, this could do it. I mean, it could probably do a good job of that first review of identifying, which proposals should be discussed and which shouldn't.
Yeah.
But then what you'll get people who hack the AI and sort of like to modify the proposal system, right?
Yeah, I mean, it'll only work if you sort of redesign the templates. And so, as you say, as a first review, the real question is the so what question, not really the precise data question.
Right.
And so all the cosmetics around is groundbreaking. It's going to save the world from everything. All that can be completely eliminated from review. And then you can look at what's the input, what's the process, what's expected output, what's uncertainty around that. That could give you a score of some sort. And as you say, that could be a screening process, perhaps.
Right. Right. I mean, given the amount of people proposing these days, having a screening mechanism, I think, would be really useful. Right.
Yeah, the screening mechanism.
I do that potentially.
Yeah, it'd be a very interesting study, Donna. If you have some sort of a non-human screen, and then humans get involved, it will be very interesting to see if that substantially reduces the bias. And if you find that, that could be really interesting, right?
I'm not sure that there's. I mean, the anonymization studies that I've cited don't find a lot of evidence of bias, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that bias is driving all the results. Again, I think think about the whole life course, right? Access to networks, access to support throughout one's career early on can set the stage for later career outcomes. And I can think of a world where, Black investigators didn't have the same advantages of white investigators throughout their, college and graduate school and postdoctoral experiences. We actually see careers starting to diverge right around the postdoc, where they have the same number of publications but lower citations. And so that kind of that small disadvantage just accumulates over time.
And there is a very critical window around that time, right? That if you cannot climb out of that, then it becomes really difficult. So you got to follow up on this, Donna, recently, reflections on race, ethnicity, and NIH Research Awards. And so you're kind of going back and looking at the data. So I think you mentioned this already. Did you find anything new in the latest analysis?
No, I actually have a proposal right now sitting at the National Institutes of General Medicine. It's going to go into a second review. And what we're going to look at is looking at faculty at research universities by race, and then looking at whether or not they're equally likely to get promoted conditional on their grants and publications. And then looking at whether or not conditional on having their first R01, do they get a renewal, right? And then we'll have information on where they're located, what science they're doing, and their research history. So that's my next project, but I'm waiting on the decision on that one.
Yeah, hopefully that rises to the top, Donna. So So I want to get into another topic. You have a few papers around this. Gender, race, and academic career outcomes. Does economics mirror other disciplines? You see here the textbook model of the labor market posits that workers are paid their marginal products. In the setting, equally productive workers should be paid and promoted at the same rate. While in the general labor market, we are able to observe individual education, industry, occupation, and earnings, in most cases, it's difficult to link individuals' capital investments and productivity outcomes. So you say my research has focused on academic labor markets because capital in the form of federal research funding and output in the form of publications and citations can be linked to individuals to yield new findings about academic careers and knowledge production. That's really interesting. So this is a little bit less uncertain. The outputs are very easily measurable.
Right.
The inputs are as well. And so the black box in this case is little bit of a gray box. But as you say, in the labor markets in general, it's really difficult to control for these inputs and outputs. So what do you find in this more, let's say, less uncertain input and output process in the academic markets?
Well, so that general set of research questions kind of motivated the work that we did at NIH because, we were linking publications to individuals and looking at the impact on whether or not they get research funding, which then feeds into more publications. So I think that what we really want, I came at this research because I'm interested in, do women's and men's careers differ? This was me as an assistant professor wondering whether or not, women are equally likely to get promoted because we have an up and out system or out system in academia. And so that's kind of how I started down this path of looking at, how your productivity is rewarded within academia, because that's what the model says. The people who publish the most papers or the highest impact papers or some mix of the two should, receive the biggest rewards, right? So that's kind of what I've been trying to look at from various angles. And, we don't really understand how people are promoted. Right. Academia has a very linear promotion process, which also makes it easier than, how do you understand who's promoted in a software firm? Right.
Right.
Right. Are the people who are bad at coding the ones that become managers?
No, we typically have two different tracks. We have a technical track and a business managerial track.
Right.
And so people tend to gravitate toward either one of those. In academics, you have only one track, so that makes it easier.
Right.
That reduces uncertainty.
Right. Right. I mean, I think that, computer science, to the extent that people post code on GitHub, right, you could see what they're doing, you could look at their productivity, but then that's where you would need the AI to see whether or not the code actually works and is a real contribution, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're getting close to not needing humans to code either. The AI could code it itself.
Right.
And so we are entering a pretty dangerous situation in terms of human productivity question. But in the academic arena, I want to ask you, I know a few research universities that put a lot of focus on the number of papers being published. So if I just count the papers, that's one sort of an output.
Right.
And how do you control for the quality of papers?
That's a $1 million question. Seriously, you could think of it citations, right? But this is where, modeling will come in. So who cites what paper, right? If I'm doing a literature review, then I want to find all the papers on this topic and I'll cite all of those papers. But if you're doing a research project, do you cite only your friends? Do you cite only your advisor and your advisor's students? I I color outside of disciplinary lines. I do demographic research. Demographers cite everybody. I mean, it's just like, oh my goodness. The citations they expect are quite high, whereas economists, you know, you look at the papers in this field in the last 10 years, you don't cite anything before that, right? So, you know, understanding, you know, and that should be factored in to quality, right? And we found in our 2018 paper that the impact factors of journals were very predictive, right? An impact factor weighted measure of publications. Well, you know, it kind of makes sense, right? Because you don't see a person's citations when you get a bio sketch for a proposal review, but you do see the journals and you say, oh, Science, Cell, Nature, yeah, you've published in all the big ones, so you're good, right? So journals are kind of a proxy measure of quality for publications.
But then, as you say, if there is a secret handshake going on, we see high concentrations of Nobel laureates in a few universities, and publications in major journals are also very highly concentrated. So there is a lot of a larger question whether there's a secret handshake process going on in academics. Yeah.
Right, and so that's a real issue. But you know, so how do you decide what to cite, right? And we know citations count for, you know, the quality of a university is measured by the number of citations of the faculty, or the quality of the researcher is measured by the number of citations, right? But is that an accurate measure? I mean, and if you go down the course of study of looking at what scientometricians do, it's like there's as many different measures of quality as there are people studying in this area. So it's a real open question. But I think we need it for understanding a contribution in science, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's just the country club effect. If you're part of a country club, you have a lot of country club friends. And if you're not part of the country club, you don't have country club friends typically. And so the same thing happens in academics, I think. It's not as crass, but it is generally the same concept.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and there's a hierarchy, right?
And so I want to go into a slightly different topic. So does mentoring increase the collaboration networks of female economists and evaluation of the cement randomized trial? So you're looking at here, if female economists get mentored, does it actually improve their productivity and their ability to get promoted and things like that?
Right.
So what do you find?
Well, so there's a series of papers. What we found was, this mentoring workshop has been going on since 2004. And it featured between 2004 and 2014 random assignment to the workshop. So you had about 5 people in your subject area and 2 senior mentors, and you spent 2 days with this group of people. And because it was random assignment, it was kind of a random shock to your network, right? Because you got put into this group of about 40 or 50 women that you may not have encountered before. So it's a nice experiment from the perspective of, did this help women in their careers, 1, and 2, we did a study of the mechanism. Well, we found that women at top 100 institutions worldwide were more likely to get tenure, but people at lower ranked institutions were not, which is a bit troubling. We found that they published more papers, and they published more top 5 papers. So there are 5 journals that are the top 5. And so we found that they were significantly more likely to publish top 5. There's marginally significant impact on getting research funding. But overall, it had a large positive impact on their career outcomes. So the question is, how can a 2.5-day workshop have such huge effects? So our hypothesis, we know that they published more papers. So I thought, well, maybe they're finding new co-authors at this workshop. This is actually a graduate student of mine, was very interested in networks and how networks. And I'm like, well, you know, there's not like exogenous shocks to networks, except for here, this experiment is an exogenous shock to the network. So you can go to the publications and you can look at their publications after they've been mentored and see, well, what happens to their networks. And we were surprised in that very few women co-authored with each other. They had this experience, they liked this experience, they were more successful, and their networks got larger, but it wasn't with other women at the conference. So we interpreted that as indicating that there was tacit knowledge provided at this conference that empowered the women who received the mentoring treatment to expand their collaborative networks.
And generally, if I understand this correctly, Donna, generally the collaborative networks are beneficial,
right,
both in terms of publication, in terms of career. And so would you say, is that a deficiency in women academics? They don't, either they don't have the time or the preference for large networks?
I think it's because, you know, there may be 30% of the women in the economics profession are female. Yeah. But in my department, it's me and one other woman, right? So we're, you know, if you look at your local context in academia, there aren't a lot of people who look like you, right? But if you bring them together and you give people an opportunity to get to know people who look like them and doing the same things that they're doing, it's gonna, we think that sort of tacit knowledge of being able to refer to each other, you know, for advice, and even senior mentors at the program to ask them for advice about how to manage their careers, it empowered those women and contributed to their success.
Yeah, I always regretted not going to academics, Donna. I thought academics was pure. Everybody is trying to advance knowledge, and that's that. But it's not quite that easy, is it?
No, academia is a social, you know, it's a society, right? And it has, it's very, you've got a lot of people who have, you know, lifetime employment, who really like their lifetime employment and don't like changes, right? I mean, I thought that academia would be a very liberal environment. And but if you think of the employment relationships, in many ways, it's a very conservative environment because they don't want to, they want to do what they do, you know.
It's very hierarchical, it looks to me, yeah.
They don't have bosses. They can do their research, they can do their teaching, and nobody can really tell a tenured faculty member what to do.
Yeah, it's a bit like a corporation where, I mean, in a company, we have these types of people too, you know. They've been there for 30 years and nobody's going to fire them type people.
Right.
And it is, you know, somewhat inefficient sometimes to have those types of people because you can fire them. So, yeah, it's a really interesting, the structural question for academics, you know. So if you were to create a new university and you want to really break the status quo, how will you set it up? How will you hire? How will you promote? How will you measure? How would you provide incentives? What are the things that you learn from all these research?
Well, I mean, I think that, so I have a tenure story that has, I didn't send you this research paper, but because it's relatively new, but I was doing a study on the social safety net. And Kansas, the state of Kansas, has put restrictions on the social safety net. And I presented some data from preliminary research, and then the governor's office didn't like the data. So they called the university and complained, right? And I'm like, thank God I have tenure, right?
That's the beauty of it, yeah.
Right. I mean, so I'm fully vested in this tenure process. But you know, I'm also an economist. I believe in incentives. So there are ways to use pay and recognition to incentivize behavior or to incentivize people to find a better match in terms of what they're wanting to do if they don't want to do research anymore, right?
No, I'm a big fan of the tenure process, I have to say. I mean, you know, the academics I talk to are all very comfortable with what they're doing, which is quite important to advance knowledge, I think.
Right, right. I mean, you know, back when I was doing this work on gender in the economics profession, there were very few people doing it. And so I was kind of off by myself in a little corner. And then now there's a lot of it being done in the profession, which I think is great. But, you know, people could have viewed that negatively had I not had tenure, right? So you need, you know, some research is not popular, but it nevertheless is important. And so you need some sort of guarantee within the system to be able to produce that work. But at the same time, you also need to reward good behavior and dissuade bad behavior.
Yes, I want to finish up with your recent paper, which is very topical, different topic, association of mask mandates and COVID-19 case rates, right, hospitalizations and deaths in Kansas. So you said the study examined the association between mask mandates in Kansas counties and COVID-19 cases, hospitalization and deaths. The Kansas order that took effect on July 3rd, I believe it's in 2021, I would think, right? 2020? Yeah. 2020. Was adopted by only 15 counties, and 68 counties did not have a mandate through October. And the second mask mandate under order took effect in November 25, and 40 additional counties adopted it. So you're finding a distinct difference in sort of mortality, hospitalization, and so on between counties that adopted mask mandates and those who did not, right? And I mean, that's a lot. I mean, I don't know if this is in the research, Donna. That's a longer time question, which is, you know, this idea that if we slow it down, we can escape it. And that has been sort of, it has been a very difficult thing to pin down because we have this many waves of COVID-19 happening all around the world.
Right.
And so what is your take on that from a policy perspective?
Well, during that time period, we didn't have the vaccine, right?
Yeah.
And we had hospitals that were, you know, bulging with patients, and you know, people were dying because of overextended hospitals, right? So I think that at that time, the mask mandate was sound public policy if you wanted to allocate your scarce hospital resources. And we showed that it was effective, right? You know, COVID is just, I mean, it's a classic pandemic where you have wave after wave after wave. The vaccine, you know, we get this wonderful scientific discovery of the mRNA vaccines, but, you know, we don't have the years to study it like we would have for like measles, right? So as a result, you know, you're having to update your information in real time. So yeah, I mean, we were vaccinated. My whole family was vaccinated in October. We all got sick, right? Despite being vaccinated, because they hadn't interpreted the data to say, oh, after 6 months you need a booster. So, you know, I think that at the time the mask mandate was really sound policy. I was traveling when the courts threw out the mask mandate for public transportation, so I was away. I wore a mask on the airplane. Everybody was wearing a mask on the airplane. When I left, Very few of us were wearing masks on the plane when I came back. But after having had a whole family with COVID and a husband who was hospitalized twice, had to go to the ER twice with, COVID pneumonia and real pneumonia, preventing it, I'd pay a lot of money to prevent it, right? Even though we didn't quite prevent it from happening. If the vaccine truly prevented you from prevented mortality, then it was worth every penny, right? Saved us.
I'm a big fan of masking. So, so last 3 years, I haven't had a cold. I typically get a cold every year.
Right.
And so I'm going to continue to mask, even after COVID completely goes away. I have an excuse now.
Right.
When I get on a train or an airplane, people won't, look at me as a weird guy, because mask allows you to sort of not get common diseases. It's all airborne diseases, most of them.
Right. Now, masking is tremendously effective.
Yeah.
And, we showed it with Kansas data. There was a randomized controlled trial that showed its effectiveness. I think it was in Bangladesh. It's really hard to run a randomized controlled trial of masking because you can't observe people wearing a mask at home or whatever. But I would never trust a doctor who wanted to operate on me who didn't wear a mask, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to end on a sort of a philosophical question. So STEM used to be very sort of deterministic, engineering-oriented field. And we are increasingly removing humans from those processes. We can design buildings, we can create cars, airplanes without using humans because computers can do a lot of those things. So we might find STEM to be more human-oriented activity in the future, that women might be more equipped to really take on than men. Men are, model builders, equation solvers, differential equations, whatever. None of those things are needed anymore because they can deploy computers to do all of those. So do you see sort of a gender switching in STEM?
Well, maybe a gender convergence.
Conversion, yeah.
Yeah, I do think that we need those models, right? We need, the sort of the model building, the analytics, that sort of manipulation of the environment type of work. But we also, for science to realize its full potential for society, we also need to have the society part of it, right? Part of the failure in public health during COVID was scientists not really thinking about society when they were trying to, convince people to do the right, to protect people around them. And so social science and science together, I think, creates better outcomes for people than just, sitting in your silos. So that's why I've always, crossed disciplinary boundaries, talked to people in other disciplines, because I think that having those conversations or working with people across our disciplinary boundaries will create more meaningful impact. I mean, really, ultimately, maybe citations aren't the proper way to measure impact, but you want to make the world a better place, and you do that by learning from others and taking those ideas and synthesizing them to address the challenges that you're trying to understand.
Yes, citations can be counted, but good ideas typically cannot be counted. So,
right.
In a world counting or arithmetic works, that's one thing, but more generally speaking, arithmetic doesn't work anymore. I mean, counting things is not that useful. We have machines that do all of that stuff.
Right, right. And so how do you, how do you identify good things, right? Or impactful things? Those are hard questions, right?
Those are hard questions, and hopefully we'll move forward with, better ideas. So yeah, excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Donna. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Oh, my pleasure. I really look forward to seeing the conversation.
I'll send you all the details once I put it together.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Gill. It's good to meet you.
Thank you.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.